In previous period, we have seen that the pollination by insect and birds. Now, today we will start about the pollination of bats. It is known as a chiropterophily. Chiropterophily, the pollination by the bats. Now, in this, what happens? The bat can transport pollen over a long distance and sometimes several kilometers. That's the it bring about the pollination for within the plant. This plant have the several kilometer long. Then such type of plant they have the adaptations occurs within the flowers. This adaptation are first one is the they have dull color. Flower have the dull color. This is the first adaptation in bat pollination. Second one, the flower have the strong fragrance for the attraction of the bats. Now, these are the one of the adaptation. Now second adaptation is the flower have the abundant nectar. That means they have more nectar inside the flower. Then for this, these bats are attracted toward the flower and bring about the pollination. Then next one, the flower produce large amount of edible pollen grains. Edibles they are used for the foods. That means bats can use pollen grain as a food. For that purpose, they also attracted towards the flowers. Now these are the adaptation in the Chiropteropterus flower. Then for example of this, the Anthocephalus, that is a kadam tree. Then Adansonia, these are the second one, and Caesalia, these are the third. Are the third example of this such type of the plants, which bring about the pollination by the bat. Now next one is outbreeding device. Outbreeding is nothing but the crossbreeding. That means the crossing of these two plants, they have the different side but same species. That's the outbreeding. Now in this what happen, many plants have the mechanism that discourage or prevent the cell pollination. Here is the to avoid the cell pollination. There is a outbreeding. This method is used because why the repeated self division which causes the inbreeding depression and the same character which is transferred from generation to generation. They may be there is no variations occurs during this cell pollination, and that's why the new character not arise. There is no evolutions and there is no new character arise within the plant if there is a repeated self pollinations occurs. Then to promote cross pollination and increase genetic diversity, and such that plant have evolved wide variety of sexual strategies. There are different strategies evolved in the sexual reproduction to cross pollination or the outbreedings. Now what happened during the if the outbreeding is occurs or the cross pollination is occurs within the plants, then one of the most important changes occur inside this, that is the genetic diversity. Diversity is a difference, and genetic there is genotype. There it means if the crossing also occurs within among the individual of the plants of the same species, then what happens, the genotype of the different plant are combined and they transport to the next generation. That genetic diversity, and it is the essential factor for evolution and natural selection. That means evolution is must, then a new character arises from the crossing of the new two different varieties of same species. And there is a natural selection is also importance of the due to the genetic diversity. Now next one, the if this continuous self pollination, what happen if the continuous self pollination result in inbreeding depression. That means this variety continuously self pollinated, the depressing the character or depressing this inbreeding, and there is there is no evolutions, and there is no new character arise in the individual, and there is no natural selection. Then therefore this plant have developed many devices to encourage the cross pollination. There are many strategies that occurs to develop or to encourage the cross pollination, and this cross pollination is responsible for the uh, arising the new character within the plant. Now for example, there are certain example in this cross pollination. One is unisexuality. Now this is one of the outbreeding device, that is a cross pollination device. There are certain devices. Then unisexuality, uni means single sexuality, there is a single flower, single plant, they having the single sex. It may be the male or it may be the female. That's the unisexuality. If the flower uh, contain the plant either may be the male or it may be the female. They are both plants are separated, male and female plants are separated. That's known as this unisexuality, unisexual flowers. It is also called as a dioecium. Dioecium, that's two different plants, they have their special reproductive parts. Now these flowers are unisexual, then there is a self pollination is not possible because the plant are different and there may be more chances of cross pollination due to the separation of this plant. Then the plant may be monoecious, they having the both of these. For example, maize or dioecious and mulberry, papaya. These are the example of the monoecious plants. That's unisexuality. Now next one is the dichogamy. Now this name itself indicates that the dicho means two, gamy means gametes. Here is we can see that we have to know that's the timing of maturation of stamens and anther. Here is a difference in the timing between this anther and stamen maturity. Uh, in this, that's the in this device, the anther and stigma mature at different times in a bisexual flower, so as to prevent the self pollination. If the anther mature earlier than the stigma, then self pollination is not possible. On the contrary, if the stigma is mature firstly and anther is mature late time, at the late, what happen, there is also prevention of the self pollination. Because of before, if the anther is mature late, what happen, stigma already mature and it accept pollen from the another plants, cross pollination occurs, then there is no use of the self pollen grain of the their plant. Then this dichogamy again, two types. One is a protandry, second is a protogyny. Now this name also indicates its meaning. That's the first one is a protandry. This protandry, pro means first, andry means androgen. Here androgen, oh sorry, androecium. Now this androecium, it is the male reproductive parts, and it is in this type, this androecium mature earlier. Here is the earlier maturation of the androecium than the gynoecium. Now this is proto andry. Proto means first, andry means androecium. Androecium mature first in the flower and then gynoecium. Therefore, it prevents the self pollination. For example, sunflower, floret of the sunflower is the example of this protandry. Second one is the protogyny. On contrary to this, or in on contrary protogyny, this pro means first, gyne means gynoecium. In this type, there is a gynoecium is mature earlier than the androecium. Then this type of is known as the protandry. Here is a maturation time is different between the anther and stigma. Now these are two types. The next one is a prepotency. Prepotency. There is here, that's a pollen grain of other flower germinate rapidly over the stigma than the pollen grain from the same flower. That's a prepotency. Here is if we take the flowers, their pollen grain of the same flower is mature late, or they this pollen of other flower which fall on this previous flower, they are mature or they are uh, grow fastly over the stigma than the self same flower. That means it also avoid the cross pollination, sorry, self pollination. That means जे सेल्फ पोलन ग्रेन असतात सेल्फ फ्लावरवरचे ते लेट मॅच्युअर त्या जर्मिनेट होतात आणि अदर फ्लावरवरचे जे पोलन ग्रेन आहेत ते लवकर मॅच्युअर होतात. दॅट नॉज अ प्री पोटेन्सी. देअर फोर इट गिव्हन दिस प्रिफरन्स टू द pollen of another flower to enhance the pollination. And then this type of this device is known as the prepotency. For example is a apple. Then next term is a heterostyly. Hetero means different. Hetero means different. Styly means styles. Styles, it is a part of the carpels, that is stigma, style, ovary. With the long tube, that's the styly. They have the different one. Now here is the stigma, the style. The length of these styles is different in a different plant. In some plants like primula, or for example in the primose plant, there are two or three forms of the flowers. Two or three type of flower present in case of the primose, in which what happen, the stigma and anther are placed at the different levels within the flower. The position of the stigma and position of the anther is placed within the flower in a different way, or there is the distance between these two is more. Therefore, it prevent the polyspermy. Now, this is known as heterostyly, or it's also on the contrary, it's also known as heteroanthy. Heteroanthy means different in the location or length of these anthers. It's also known as a heteroanthy because it depend on the different location of the anthers. Is a heterostyly and heteroanthy. Now, next one, it prevent the pollination from reaching the stigma and pollinating it. That means we can already say that it prevent the self pollination. Therefore, there is a difference in the location. Then in heteromorphic flower, there is a different in location. Heteromorphic flower, pollen grain produced from another pollinate stigma produced at the same level. Here is a heteromorphic pollen grain produced from another pollinate stigma produced at the same level. Then for this is an example of this heterostyly. Here you can see that this is the two flowers. There is a different in the length of the anther and the stigma. In the first flower, we can say that the length of the style is more. Then the stigma is exposed to outside and anther present below the stigma at the center region of the style. Here is that's the pollen grain presence or anther presence in the middle region, and the style is elongated, and therefore the pollen grains cannot reach up to the stigma. This one. In second case, what happened, the size of the style is short, is within the flower, and the anther grows on the tip region. Here there is also the difference between the length of the anther and stigma take place. Therefore, also prevent the self pollination. Then next term is the Hercogyne. Hercogyne, it is a mechanical device which help for the self uh, pollination, or which prevent the self pollination in the bisexual flower. Bisexual means the flower having the both sexes. That's the androecium and gynoecium. But in this part, we have to prevent this self pollination within the flower. Then certain mechanical device are also they having the produce the plant, and then it prevent the self pollination. Now next one, in plant, the natural they have the natural physical barriers present between the sex organ to avoid the contact between the pollen and stigma of the same flower. That means certain character or the part develop inside the flower to prevent the transfer of pollen from this anther to the stigma within the flower. that means they are separated from each other. Although they present within the single flower, but they are prevented from each other from self pollination. Now this known as a hercogamy. Now here for example in the calotropis, let us say calotropis ruskii, calotropis, they have the penta-angular stigma. The structure of the stigma is made of such a type that they are exposed to outside. Any anther presents below this stigma and is covered by this covering. That's a position, the above independent stigma is the position above the level of the anther pollina. That means position of the stigma is over the anther. This is an example of this hercogyne, for example, calotropis. This is a calotropis flower. Now in this is the flower, and this flower of the calotropis. Here is, this is the stigma. Stigma is penta-angular, and this anther is present below the stigma. Now this anther is surrounded by the covering. That's covering was a uh, stamina corona. The stamina corona which covered these anthers. Now let us see that we can say that the stamina corona. This is a diagram. We can see that's the gynoecium present outside is pentalocular, and the stamina is covered by this anther. Therefore, the pollen grain from the anther cannot reach up to this gynoecium. Therefore, it prevent the entry of this pollen grain from anther to the stigma. That's known as a hercogamy. This is the best example of this calotropis. Then next one is a self incompatibility. Now this what happened? Incomplete. We have already say that the incompatibility. There is no matching of these gametes. That's a incompatibility. If the gametes of one species of flower or pollen grain of one species of flower is fall on the another species of the flower, then there is no compatibility. This pollen not germinate on the stigma of the another flower of the different species. That's the incompatibility. Sometime what happen, they have the same flower and the same pollen grains falls on the stigma, but there is also the not germination of pollen grain. Self incompatibility, that means self sterility, also known as self sterility. That means sterility, there the individual are unable to reproduce. Self means same flower. It is the genetic mechanism here due to which the germination of pollen on stigma of the same flower is inhibited. If we take this flower, they having the pollen grains and stigma both are. If the pollen grain of same flower fall on the stigma, there is no germination of the pollen grain take place. Why? It is the self incompatibility. There is stigma in which what happens, the certain proteins material which inhibit the growth of these pollen grains, and for which it enhance the crossbreeding or enhance the outbreedings. For example, in case of these tobacco plants, there is the self incompatibility. Self pollination is avoided and cross pollination is preferred. It means जे स्वतःचेच गेमेट्स जे आहेत त्या गेमेटला किंवा पोलन ग्रेनला जर्मिनेट होऊ देत नाही स्टिग्मा. दॅट इज सेल्फ इनकम्पॅटिबिलिटी. देन in all period uh, in all breeding programs, the plants are hand pollinated to ensure cross pollination between selected varieties. Certain plants, that is the wheat and rice, they have the hand pollinated. That means bring about this artificial medium for the pollination. Male flower is fall on the pollen grain of male flower is fall on the stigma of the female flowers. It is hand pollinated which is ensure for the cross pollination to improve the variety of the crop plants. Now the genetic or the diversity or genetically how these self incompatibility occurs, in which there is a certain genes present inside this plant. They prevent self combination, cell pollination, and it prefer the cross pollination. Now here is take example of this. Suppose this is a pollen grain. In a first diagram this pollen grain and their genotypes, the genetic material presents. First, if the stigma which contain the genotypes S1 S2, they are the genotype. Here is a S1 and S2, these are the genotypes of the stigma. Then there are different pollen grains. So if the pollen grains fall on this, that is S3 and S4, S3 and S4, these are the pollen grains which fall on the stigma. Now these pollen grains coming from the different plant of the same species, they are allowed to grow. There is a germination occurs and pollen tube arise inside this, and fertilization is possible or germination is possible. In second step, what happen? The genotype of the gynoecium is same or still, but the genotype of the pollen grain is different. That is ES1 and ES4. Here is a S1 is prohibited. S1 is not germinated, but S4 is germinated because these are the self pollination. That means S1, here is S1 genotype of this stigma, and on the same flower this S1 gametes. This pollination is prevented. Then another, the genotypes of the stigma is same. The genotype of the pollen grain is different. That's for the ES1 and ES2 same. That's the cell pollination. Here the cell pollination is prohibited or prevented. Only cross pollination is preferred. It is a genetic mechanism where the it is of the self incompatibility. This is a genetic method of the self incompatibility.